Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Wistrand, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute. Thank you for joining us for a discussion of After the Gulag, a history of memory in Russia's far north. Before I introduce our guest, I would like to remind you that you can stay up to date on the Kennan Institute's activities by visiting the Kennan Institute's website and subscribing to our blogs and podcasts. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the Department of State's Title VIII program for its generous support of several of the Kennan Institute's fellowships. They allow us to host rising scholars in the field, such as today's guest, Dr. Tyler Kirk. Dr. Kirk is an associate professor in the Arthur T. Fatauer Chair in History at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. He's the author of Remembering the Gulag, A History of Memory in Russia's Far North, which was published by Indiana University Press in December 2023. He's also a former Title VIII scholar with the Kennan Institute. After our guest speaks, there will be a question and answer period. For our audience, you may submit a question via the function at the base of your Zoom screen. And I want to encourage you, you should feel free to start submitting your questions anytime during the discussion, and we'll get to them in the latter half. Finally, as a reminder, today's discussion is being recorded. So with that, Tyler, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much, Jennifer, for the invitation. And again, very much enjoyed my time at the Kennan Institute back in 2019 when I was still working on this book, and I'm happy that it finally saw the light of day in December 2023, and so I'm happy to talk with you guys today about the book and its relevance on this Day of Victims of Political Repression in Russia. And so. Yeah, so just to kick things off, this is a book, a project that I've been working on for many years now. It's titled After the Gulag: A History of Memory in Russia's Far North. And the basic premise of the book is that it explores how ordinary political prisoners navigated their lives after release, but also how they translated their experiences in the Gulag and afterward into memoirs, letters, and art, and how they contributed alongside the emerging Memorial Society to the construction of historical memory or cultural memory of the Gulag and Stalinist repression at this democratic moment in Soviet and early post-Soviet Russian history. And it's a very different country to today than it was then. And one of the other, I guess, central arguments of the book is that Gulag survivors and their children and exiles in cooperation with people who had not been repressed through the Memorial Society and then later the Repentance Foundation, and I'll talk about who they were, who they are briefly in a little bit. But they basically that the book makes the argument that they contributed to the formation of an alternate history of the Soviet Union. And I say that alternate because the evidence that these survivors, that these people put forward was found primarily in non-state archives. When during Glasnost and Perestroika in the late 1980s, and then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they very intentionally chose not to donate their personal archives, their memoirs, letters, artwork to state archives. And this is ultimately what made it so powerful. It's what makes the event, October 29th event, Return of the Names, so powerful, is that it's based on the details of individual lives of thousands of ordinary Soviet people. And today, ultimately, this narrative is seen as a threat by the Putin regime because it lays bare the crimes of the Soviet regime and juxtaposes these crimes with the cult of the victory of World War II. And so, which is used as a symbol of Russian nationalism, military might, and imperialism, as we're all horrifyingly familiar with. And so that's kind of the central premise of the book, and we'll talk more about it and its connection to this day of memory, October 30th in Russia. Let's go to the next slide. But first, I just wanted to really briefly touch on, for people who maybe are unfamiliar, the Gulag existed roughly between 1930 and 1960. More than 25 million were imprisoned or exiled throughout the Soviet Union, from the north to the south, from the west to the east. This isn't all at one time, of course. The Gulag was somewhat of a revolving door, as other historians have written about in quite in detail.
Tyler,
And so
sorry, can
the
I I
Yeah.
don't think everyone has seen your slides. Can you make sure that they
Oh
are?
no.
We're getting a
Okay.
couple.
Let me oh yeah, multiple. Okay. Okay, does that work for everybody now?
Not yet, I don't think.
Uh, okay.
Okay,
How about
now it's
that?
coming through.
Oh
Yep,
no.
great.
Okay. Well, you all you missed was the cover of my book in that preamble, which you can you can look at any other time. But thanks for stopping that before you got any further along. Um, oh boy, I'm not great with technology, so thanks for the warning. So the Gulag was this massive prison system in short, and it included thousands of prisons, camps, and exile settlements across the length and breadth of the Soviet Union. It served the needs of the Soviet economy, and theoretically, it contributed to the reforging of wayward Soviet citizens. So the idea was that people would go and do forced labor, and that labor would transform them into upstanding Soviet citizens. And the officials kind of paid lip service to this, of course, because conditions were so brutal in the camps that uh, unknown millions died in the Gulag. And so the term, though, that we were all familiar with in the West was popularized with the publication in 1973 of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. Um, and the region that I have up on the screen here, this map, shows the Komi Republic. This is the region of the Russian Far North that I did my research in, that I wrote the book about. And I chose this region specifically because six of Komi's seven cities were built by forced labor. It is a region that was first settled by the indigenous Finno-Ugric Komi people. It had been a dumping ground for exiles, a very small number of exiles in the late 19th century. But it became during the Soviet period, especially under Stalin, an era of intense resource extraction, intense colonization by forced labor. And so it presented itself as this wonderful opportunity, a very fascinating opportunity to study something that was so incredibly massive that spanned the breadth of the Soviet Union in a very concentrated form. And the other really interesting thing about I found focusing on this regional history is that when you study something like the Gulag, which has been written about on the basis of like central archives in Moscow and St. Petersburg, many times over. History looks quite different when seen from a regional perspective, and I very much intentionally eschewed central archives in order to tell the story of the Russian Far North and to shed new light on the ways in which Gulag survivors made their way after release and readapted to Soviet society, but also how they laid the foundations for the future commemoration of the Gulag and political repression. And so this is the Komi region. It shows Vorkuta, Abez, Inta, Pichora, Ukhta as main sites of the Gulag in the region. Um, and so to move to the next slide. And so prisoners survived the camps in part by banding together and forming friendships and becoming a part of what they called a brotherhood of zeks, a brotherhood of prisoners. Zek is a slang for Russian term zaklучённый, which is prisoner. Um, and they often referred in their memoirs and letters to their comrades in unhappiness. And so these small groups that they used to survive in the camps and to adapt to life after release were foundational to the memory project that emerged at first after Stalin's death in the early 50s, but then again with renewed force and renewed interest in the late 1980s. And so we often think of the Solovetsky Stone or other monuments in the post-Soviet period as some of the first monuments to the victims of political repression in the Soviet Union. Um, but one of the first was erected in Inta, outside the gates of one of the main camps in the region, by Latvian prisoners. And they did this, fascinatingly enough, using materials from inside the camps, and the comrades who had been released already but were living in exile in the region erected this monument to Latvians who had perished in the Gulag or in exile. And it was done in this period following Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech, and this period of confusion in which this state and society, the Communist Party, was trying to figure out what to say about Stalin in the wake of Khrushchev's speech denouncing him. And so it's this fascinating document that I found in the archives, in the state archives, that was taken. A photograph was taken by a KGB officer of the event. There was a Latvian priest who blessed the monument. A band played the anthem "God Save Latvia," and so it was this like really fantastic symbol. And it eventually the monument was abandoned. It was a grave marker for outside of a prison cemetery. It was abandoned. It was overgrown, and so come 1989, after Gorbachev comes to power, relaxes censorship in the Soviet Union, and renews the conversation about Stalin's victims, uh, local memorial activists, activists of the local Memorial Society, and I'll get into who they were briefly, momentarily. Work with survivors, local survivors, and even people from Latvia who had erected the monument, who come all the way back to Inta in the Komi Republic to commemorate and rededicate this monument. And in the newspapers, they were very local newspapers, party newspapers were very cagey and said, well, this is a Latvian monument for Latvians who died. And one of the people who was there in 1956, a former prisoner, said, and I have the quote here on the screen, quote, that the monument was not only a tribute to the memory of Latvians who became victims of Stalin's repressions, but also a warning to the future, to all people, Russians, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Germans, Jews. The fates of the prisoners of the Gulag Archipelago must never be repeated. And so it became this really fascinating example of this memory project that had started in the early years after Stalin's death, but was renewed when prisoners were finally given an opportunity to come forward, thanks to Gorbachev's return to this conversation and relaxation of censorship. And so um, this ultimately led to um, this moment in Soviet history, this relaxation of censorship. Gorbachev wanted to democratize the Soviet Union. He thought in part that the best way to do that was to return to the conversation about the victims of Stalinist repression, and initially wanted to keep it focused on party members, right? Members of the Communist Party that had fallen victim under Stalin. And this the relaxation of censorship, and this brought forth this new moment in Soviet history in which survivors of the Gulag, their children, exiles, and others came forward to tell their stories, because they were like, hold on a minute. I was a Communist Party member, or I wasn't a Communist Party member, but I also suffered under Stalin. I survived the Gulag. My children were born in camps. And so it became this um, wave. There was this like opening of the floodgates of memory, so to speak, and this wave of testimonies from ordinary people. Not all of them, um, many of them were educated, but not all of them were members of what we would think of as the intelligentsia. Some of them were just ordinary people who had been swept up into the sort of the quote unquote meat grinder of Stalinist repression, and wanted to write themselves into Soviet history at its end. Um, and so they represent all of these testimonies that I draw from in the book, letters, memoirs, artworks, questionnaires, oral histories. They all represent um, what other scholars have referred to as collected memories, um, or diverse, conflicting memories that are drawn from socially constructed frameworks to articulate their experiences and give meaning to them, But ultimately, it highlights that their memories are their own, and it shows the sort of plurality of memory involved in coming to terms with Stalinist repression. And many of the people, fascinatingly enough, wanted to include in their autobiographical narratives in the late 80s information about where they had been imprisoned, where people who had perished in the camps were buried. Um, and oftentimes, historians are very um, cautious when they approach these sources. But in many cases, people who wrote letters to the editors of newspaper or to Memorial, pointed out where grave sites were maybe located were usually pretty darn close to where the graves were actually were. And so it became this new era of archive building and truth telling and sort of this contributing to this effort to rewrite Soviet history on the basis of their own life stories. And so, I've referred to Gorbachev and the Communist Party, but what ultimately were these people writing against? And Gulag survivors and their children and exiles for years had been left out of narratives about how the Russian far north had been colonized, how it had been um, built up, so to speak. The infrastructure, both the built landscape, the cities, the railroads, the mining towns throughout the Russian far north were primarily built by forced labor. And newsreel films, such as this one from 1955, titled Along the Pechora Road, um, show former prisoners going to work who had been prisoners working in the mine, who went back to work after they were released in the mine because they didn't have anywhere else to go in some cases. Show them going to work in this mine, but don't refer to their repression at all, don't refer to their suffering at all. And so a big part of this I found in all of the testimonies that I read was reclaiming monuments to socialist achievement, right? The city of Vorkuta, high above the Arctic Circle, as this monument of socialist engineering and achievement, as a monument to their own achievement and their own suffering. And so it's a flipping of the script on earlier Soviet narratives. And there's, of course, many caveats and complications to this that we can discuss um, in the Q&A. And so to give you sort of a timeline, Gorbachev initiates glasnost and perestroika. The Memorial Society, which was banned in December 2021, if my memory serves me correctly, by the Russian Supreme Court, and then it awarded the year later the Nobel Peace Prize, and depicts a very sort of grim scene. But he described this very vibrant community of former prisoners in the Russian far north that depended on one another to survive, their comrades in unhappiness, so to speak. But Ivanov could not, like his comrades, bring himself to describe the things he saw in the camps, and so he drew them. And so some of these pieces of artwork that I'll now show um, that are in the book were documenting the landscape of Vorkuta as it existed when the prison camp was active up until 1960. It shows the slag heaps from the coal mine in the background. It shows, contrary to Varlam Shalamov, who writes that, there's no possibility for friendship or love or connection to other prisoners in the camps. The things are so horrible that people just they cannot connect. That Ivanov, remembers making those connections with other prisoners and draws some tender images from the camps. He also very fascinatingly, and I single him out here because he talks about being an artist after release and sending works of art to competitions in Moscow and having his name taken off the work of art or just having it being labeled like artist from Vorkuta, but drawing images very similar to these portraits of prisoners, in which he had to remove the prison numbers and title it like Miners of the Polar Stokehold or Miners of the Far North. And then only in the late 80s being able to draw these images again and contribute them to this emerging narrative from this People's Archive as, well, no, the real miners of the polar stokehold, the real colonizers of Vorkuta and the Russian far north were actually prisoners. And so it's about like reclaiming these landscapes and these cities as monuments to victims of political repression. Um, Really briefly, in this period of time, the late 80s and early 90s, there was a debate in the newspapers, and local newspapers were really vibrant. Um, uh, Examples present really vibrant examples of like how do we figure out who were victims, who were the perpetrators? Was it the party? What members of the party? Was it just Stalin? And so in this image right here that I have from an article, we have Stalin, Molotov, and Voroshilov, and they all have labels applied to them as basically enemies of the people. This was a totally fascinating, mind-blowing um, thing to see in a local newspaper that was blaming people and calling them enemies of the people, high party officials, and then thinking about, well, if Stalin waged war against, if the party waged war against its own people and led to these, hundreds of thousands, millions of deaths, like who do we blame? Who do we put on trial? And unfortunately, that moment came and went, and there was not really any sort of willpower to actually put former Chekists, former secret police officers on trial for the things that they had done in the camps. But there was this very vibrant conversation in local newspapers. There were to be an article that would come out, maybe by a party official, talking about who the victims of political repression are, that they were just party members, and then there would be a wave of letters to the editor by Gulag survivors and exiles and their children, and be like, well, hold on a second, I don't fall into this category, this neat category that you just described, and actually all of these other people were also victims. And so there was this real dialogue that shaped the development not only of um, late Soviet and post-Soviet sort of memory laws and definitions of victims and perpetrators, but it contributed to this development of this cultural memory of Stalinist repression. Much like the Return of Names event um, on October 29th, which was held this year in 112 cities internationally, not in Moscow. Even in Syktyvkar, they had a Return of the Names this year, the capital of the Komi Republic. But the early efforts to commemorate victims go back to this first attempt that I highlighted at the beginning of the talk from 1956 as putting the dead to rest, like laying the people who passed away to rest. And so there was these creation of these very eclectic funeral rites for victims of political repression that outwardly look very Orthodox or Christian, but were composed of reading of names and were very sort of eclectic in their attempt to commemorate and mourn the victims of Stalinist repression, the people who had passed away. This also contributed to the erection of monuments throughout the region in the late 80s and early 90s. This monument in Vorkuta to the victims of political repression was supposed to be a placeholder for a much larger monument that was a part of a planned triptych that unfortunately never came to pass. Two of the pieces exist. One of them is in Magadan, the Mask of Sorrow, and another one is in Siberia, I think in Novosibirsk, and then this one in Vorkuta, as sort of like the symbolizing the span of the Gulag archipelago from east to west. But again, reclaiming the mines in the city is part of the monuments to victims of political repression. And so the memoirs that I included in this book that I drew from to tell this story, tell this story. This is what they say. As Konstantin Flug, of Gulag survivor, wrote in 1986, well, what is left of their labor? Every one of the millions of the toilers of the Gulag left their own mark. Everyone has their own monument of labor. And so this was part of this real effort to reclaim Soviet landscapes. This is a monument, again, as we move into the 2000s. This was erected in 2000. Yeah, on the outside, it looks like a typical Orthodox chapel. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a sort of plinth granite plinth that contains the soil from each of the major camp complexes in Komi so that people no longer living in remote regions and living in the capital can mourn their lost family members. But when you get up close to it, you see that the mosaics are made out of scenes from the camps. The names of different camps are inscribed on this bronze tiling, and this is part of this effort to create a space that where people could mourn the dead, but also think about the camps and what and sort of the broadness, the vastness, the complexity of the system as they laid flowers every October 30th. Today, October 30th, on the day of victims of political repression, people typically meet at this monument. And so some years later, 2017, the first monument to the victims of political repression, the first state-sponsored monument, I should say, correctly, to the victims of political repression is erected in Moscow after 26 years following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Putin very famously unveiled the monument standing shoulder to shoulder with Patriarch Kirill in Solzhenitsyn's widow. And he said, quote, "We and our successors must remember the tragedy of repressions and their causes, but it does not mean one must call for revenge. Nobody can push society to the dangerous line of confrontation again." And so Putin was this is seen by many in Memorial and many others as an effort to sort of in a token way commemorate victims of political repression, but to co-opt the commemoration of these victims and the memory that they had constructed, the infrastructure of memory that they had built throughout Russia's regions, and even in Moscow, in an attempt to take over managing of this memory and how it is represented in Russian society. But despite to wrap this up, despite growing repression in the lead up to the Russo-Ukrainian War and the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, in the wake of Navalny's murder in a Russian penal colony, also in the far north, also in a region that was colonized by forced labor, people transformed the monument to victims of Stalinist repression outside of the KGB headquarters, outside of FSB headquarters in Moscow on Lubyanka Square, that they laid flowers every single night in the wake of Navalny's death to and transform this monument to the victims of political repression to Stalinist repression into a monument to the victims of political repression of the current regime. And I think this is a really powerful example of the overall trajectory of the project, that ordinary people participated in the commemoration of victims of Stalinist repression and participated in the preservation of this memory and the perpetuation of this memory by the creation of simple monuments such as this. And so with that, I think I'll wrap it up and just say that the relevance of this book in the times in which we live is that people continue to gather outside of the formal context designated for memory, outside of the state context designated for the commemoration of victims of political repression, and that they perpetuate the memory of the Gulag in doing so, and that this is ultimately what Gulag survivors and exiles and Memorial had aimed to do in the very beginning. And despite the fact that they are embattled, that this is dangerous to do in Russia today, that these are the stories that people tell about themselves and their place in Russia and in history. So I guess I'll leave it there. There's much more to say, but I don't want to take up all the time.
Oh, that was fantastic, Tyler. And I'm glad we got the slides as well so people could actually see the images that you have, because that's clearly a big part of it as well, the image involvement. So thank you. That was
Yeah.
fantastic. We have a couple questions that have come in this far. I want to remind our audience members, please do at this point, feel free to use that Q&A function at the base of your Zoom screen and to send in any questions you might have. And I forgot to mention this beforehand, but please do, if possible, include your name and affiliation so we can mention that with the questions. While we're getting a couple questions, we've got some in, but while we're waiting for a few more to populate, again, you mentioned so many things that are we could be jumping off points for discussion. A couple questions I have. One, just maybe I thought it was really interesting when you talked about, a lot of different people suffered. How do you almost differentiate, right, the suffering, or that always becomes a question, right? Do you limit it to someone who
Hmm.
spent time in a gulag or spent time in a prison, or is it someone
Hmm.
related to them, or is it someone? And I'm just curious, in your work, did you ever confront this, or in conversations with people, or how do you deal with, like, basically who has the right to claim suffering, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that was a really great question. I mean, and it's one that's answered directly in the sources. I originally really was interested in studying the parole system and how parolees, specifically Gulag prisoners, like were paroled and how they lived their lives after release. And when it became difficult to access those sources in the wake of the annexation of Crimea in 2014, I was really fascinated by this archive that existed at local memorial societies in local history museums, so outside state archives, and all of these um, documents and newspapers and letters to the editor like demanded that I expanded the definition of victim, just as they had sought to in the late 80s. I mean, every time a newspaper report would come out, it would say like, this is the definition of victim. You're qualified to be labeled a victim of political repression and entitled to some sort of very meager compensation. But that definition kept expanding as people realized the scope. I mean, this is part of a project of realization of the scope of this history. That it wasn't just a small group of, repressed party members, but it was the masses of Soviet society.
No, and that's just fascinating. Actually, I'll ask just a follow-up question while we have some other questions coming in. I'm curious, and you may not have done this. It just, in terms of your research, but obviously you think of, right, how did Germany deal with World War II and the Holocaust? How did South Africa deal with apartheid? How did Rwanda deal with, April 1994? You can look at all these other different situations where you've got this lots of
Hmm.
victims and lots of definitions. I'm curious, did you at all look at these different, any comparable situations and say, how did they define, or what did, and what was the results of defining in certain ways or not? Or how does that collectively help a society recover? And then you might not have, it's just a curiosity question.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't thought about it comparatively like that, but I think that this history is ripe for comparison. I mean, if there's a lot of literature, scholarly literature, sort of on the politics of memory, writ large, and this is a like a really pressing question too when we think about authoritarianism and democracy and um, how states try to regulate history and how they try to perpetuate memory of victims and of state crimes against humanity. And so I'm hoping that future work will come along and other regional studies will come along to contribute to this conversation because I really think it's important to continue to build on and move beyond the work that I did um, in every way that's possible in order to better understand the ways in which states and societies come to terms with difficult pasts.
Great. Well, we are getting quite a few questions that are coming in now. So the first one's a very technical question. Where was Navalny held? You referenced it in your presentation, but can you give like a more
I had that
precise?
written down. Navalny was held. I can, if it's still in my notes, I might have cut that from my notes. I did cut that from my notes. Um, he was held in the Nenets region, I believe. Um, don't quote me on that because I don't have it right directly in front of me. But he was held in a camp that was at one point connected to, at least in the region, the network of camps that existed in the Stalin period. And so he was held in an Arctic penal colony. You could easily search for newspaper. There was a lot of newspaper coverage on where he was transported to. And I remember seeing when he was transported to the Russian far north, that was part of the um, attempt to increase the severity of his punishment. So yeah, so sorry I can't name the exact place off the top of my head, but um, good
No,
question.
that's okay. No, you directed people to the appropriate sources. Next question. You mentioned Shlamov and his position that genuine bonds could not exist in the Gulag system among prisoners. Did you also see evidence of those tensions in your research?
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, there. people who testified that said that, focused on how terrible and awful and brutal the camps were, and they certainly were all of those things. I'm not trying to diminish that at all, um, because they were deadly. But people survived those inhumane conditions by banding together, and that was the theme that I kept um, seeing again and again in the memoirs and in the letters. And of course, they're writing at a very different time in Soviet history than Shalamov wrote in. So we have to take that into consideration, right? The context, the period. Um, but I highlight in the book, the Ivanov example, a case study, and then another case study of this woman, um, and Yelena Markova, who highlighted the exact same thing. She was one of many examples that I found of people who sought other prisoners to in order to survive. I mean, she exchanged letters illegally with other prisoners in the camps. She like memorized poems and shared them with others and built this huge personal archive. And some of which she's donated to the Sakharov Center, which has been banned by the Russian Supreme Court, but also the State Gulag History Museum in Moscow. And so there's just tons of physical evidence of these relationships and their importance. I mean, they really laid the foundation for the success of the Memorial movement in the late 80s and the 90s. I mean, without these networks that former prisoners used to survive the Gulag, I don't really think that the Memorial Society would have been as successful in finding these people and collecting their testimonies.
No, excellent. Next question. Great presentation. I need to get your book. In the West, these counter narratives are often assumed to reflect a desire for freedom and democracy, Western style. But how much of a role did Russian nationalism play in them? I'm thinking of ideas of Solzhenitsyn and even Navalny about the mission of Russia.
Yeah, I mean, when the prisoners the survivors, exiles, their children that I studied their testimonies, they were writing in the late 80s, sometimes before that, in the from anywhere from the 50s to the 80s. Some of them wrote in the early days of the post-Soviet period. Uh, but there was some discussion of nationalism and Soviet ethnic minorities, but there wasn't. It was more of an attempt to like understand the Soviet project and to write themselves into Soviet history. Not because some of them were patriotic in the sense that they're like, well, no, like I built this city, like Komsomol
Mhm.
brigades did not. Um, but they're what they had to say really makes like patriotic ultranationalism difficult, right? If the regime wants to claim the Red Army's victory as a Russian victory, then it also has to claim the body count from the Soviet period, and that is really tough to do. And so that's also why this is like a really unwelcome now project. So yeah, that's kind of sort of an answer.
No, thank you. Next question is, what is or is there a difference between the gulags of the past and penile colonies such as the one that Navalny stayed?
Could you say that again? Or you cut out? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's looking at what is or is a difference between the gulags of the past and the colonies like the one in which Navalny stayed. So
Sure.
basically, I guess can you
Yeah,
differentiate between these different types of?
sure. Yeah, I mean, the there's a fantastic book by Jeff Hardy called The Gulag After Stalin. I'm just looking to my bookshelf on the other side of the room. Um, and it documents how the Gulag was transformed in the wake of Stalin's death and the attempt to reform the Gulag. Judith Palo has also done a lot of really great work on contemporary Russian prisons. Um, and so the Gulag, it was markedly different. They're still penal colonies. There are prisoners doing forced labor to some extent, but it's not at all. They're in similar places. It's built on similar infrastructure, but the experiences are qualitatively different. I mean, the level of surveillance alone in contemporary Russian penal colonies is um, total. Whereas in the camps, Markova and other people were able to write letters and smuggle them back and forth, and so it's Yeah, it is quite different, but very built in similar places using similar ideas and infrastructure. But I would recommend checking out those two books at least. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question again to our audience. Do feel free to send in some more questions as well. Um, is there any differentiation between the memorialization in the Komi region of the far north and the Russian Far East? I visited the memorial in Magadan and was there the year it began. So again, kind of a
Wow.
differentiation question.
Yeah. One of the things that I discovered in the process of researching and writing this book um, is there's this wonderful archive, and part of it is in Washington, D.C. at the Library of Congress. Another part is at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. But there were um, at least over 100 different branches of Memorial, and they all published at some different periods of time newspapers on the memory projects that they were working on, such as the Russian Far East and Magadan. And uh, Magadan would be another fascinating example of a region of memory, that a region that was colonized by forced labor, that had a memorial society, and that has a very similar, if not, unique in the sense that it's a unique region in the Russian Federation, part of the Russian far north, experience in the construction and promulgation of these monuments and this archive, and these organizations. But by and large, I found that Memorial, and through these the main branch of Memorial in Moscow, documented all of these memory projects throughout the Russian Federation. And they were all very much, they're the same story of local people who had not been repressed teaming up with survivors in order to tell the stories, to build this infrastructure of memory, including monuments, museums, books of memory. So there are a lot of similarities. There are a lot of similarities between the Russian Far East and the Russian Far North. And I think that it'd be worth studying them further.
Great. And now I'm being mindful of the time and looking at the number of questions we've come in, but you're actually excellent. You give very, very succinct, time conscious answers. Next question. I'd be interested to know if you have any idea of the number of people formerly, quote, rehabilitated under Gorbachev and how much financial compensation they received, small amounts, and has this process ended? I also wanted to mention that the original Political Prisoners Day was founded by Kornei Lubarsky, astrophysicist and political prisoner, and on his birthday, October 30.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm horrible with numbers, and I can't give those to you off the top of my head. They are in my book, and some or other books. I don't want to just make this about my research. They're in other places too. Um, but I'd be happy if I would be happy to send an email about that question. I just don't have that off the top of my head. And I've read news reports, attempts to change the law on victims of political repression, and change the language of it, um, and which is kind of horrifying in the sense that they want to make it narrower and omit sort of the mass nature of the state repression. And so this is not finished. This is an ongoing thing. It's evolving in a negative way, I guess, or in the opposite direction. Rather than being more inclusive, it's becoming more exclusive. So yeah, sorry I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but they are
No, no,
documented.
no, that's fair. And actually, I appreciate that you made the offer. If someone does have a very technical question, like on numbers or something, I'm sure you can reach out to the Kennan Institute. We can put you in touch with Dr. Kirk. You can reach out to Dr. Kirk directly, and I'm
Yeah,
sure get that, get the reference point.
happy
Um,
to.
Yeah, thank you. Next question. It's a marvelous statement. You should probably mention Memorial's other role as a continuing support for elderly Memorial survivors. But the unfortunate
Mhm.
result was that children supported but did not take active roles themselves, not to say unrelated persons. Okay, so maybe just kind of like Memorial
Yeah,
support or other people.
yeah, yeah. I mean, children were active in broadening the definition of victims in Komi, in the Komi region. I interviewed some of them for the book. Uh, they, in some cases, stayed in touch and with Memorial and Fond Pakayanya in the Russian Far North, but in other cases, they they just kind of drifted away after they had deposited their parents or their stories to the archive. I don't blame them for not wanting to continually relitigate or rehash sort of the worst moments of their life. But I do, in from the oral histories of the interviews I've done and the other research I've done, I do know that they were very much wanting to be remembered as part of this project.
That excellent. And as I say, that segues very well into our next question, which says, thank you for sharing this work. Can you say more about your sources and how you were able to access them? Time span, locations,
Yeah.
primary, secondary. So yeah, maybe I think a lot of people are curious about. I know you talked about your sourcing. Maybe go into detail a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that I'm not the last, but I think for the time being, I may be one of the last Western researchers to have been able to go to the Russian far north. I spent my very first trip to Syktyvkar was as an undergraduate exchange student from the University of Maine at Farmington, and so I spent close to a decade of building relationships with people in the region, with Mikhail Rokachev, who was one of the founders of Memorial in the region, and Fond Pakayanya. Um, I worked in the archive. This is not a knock on the archivists at the National Archive of the Komi Republic. I mean, we're also dealing with new laws and restrictions that were placed on them. And so I found that I was able to access like political department reports from the camps or like party commission reports, which may be even impossible to read now. Um, but like documents in the state archives that testify to the parties in the states. Um, how to say this, that they weren't particularly excited when women, good quote unquote good party women, to use one example, would marry a former prisoner and lay their party card on the table and walk out of the room. Um, and the sources, though, I mean, I wanted to study life after the Gulag, and the sources led me away from the state archive. I found them in local history museums. I found them in, by word of mouth. People had personal archives that they had not donated yet, or their children had not donated, and they were like, please use these as part of your story. Um, Memorial throughout the region. Um, the collection of documents and the preservation of documents was somewhat hampered by the fact that they never knew when the door was going to get kicked in and the project was going to be over. So some of their archive went home with people and was lost, or some of the archive was preserved in the National Library of the Komi Republic. So it took looking at these like non-traditional places. This archive exists in the places that were colonized by forced labor. And that's the other fascinating thing. I mean, you can go to the local history museum in Ukhta, and there's an entire room of unpublished memoirs and letters um, that museum workers use to tell the story of their city. And so the same goes for the artworks. I mean, the artworks that prisoners sent for a long time, and I hope it's still up. The Memorial Society website had this archive of Gulag artworks that I think could be used. I'd make the argument, and I'm very interested in studying the environmental history of political repression in the Soviet Union and how those artworks depict landscapes that were forever altered by forced labor and industrialization and now climate change. And so, yeah, I really was interested in non-state perspectives. I wanted to capture the voices of survivors. I wanted to capture their interactions, the dialogue that they engaged in with those who had not been repressed. And so letters back and forth between Memorial and survivors were really important in capturing that. But yeah, it was this wonderful period of discovery. I think that I just followed the breadcrumbs, to be honest, in the best possible way. And there's many good sources in the United States too. At the Hoover Institution on the West Coast, the Library of Congress, the Kennan Institute. There are It's still possible to do this work. But getting down in the nitty-gritty in regional archives, I think for the time being is definitely off the table, unfortunately.
No, I think you are correct. And that actually, again, a good segue to our next question. I'm a Belarusian scholar in exile. Thank you for your presentation. What methodology did you use in your research? I'm asking as someone interested in working with memoirs myself. So yeah,
Yeah.
maybe even kind of how do you plan to continue moving forward? Should you have limited access to kind of what you found to be rich sources?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I'd be happy to have a longer conversation with this person. Um, if they want to send an email. But I thought a lot about like Leona Toker's work and on Gulag memoirs as a genre, and Irina Piperno's work on diaries of victims of repression, and John Paul Eakin, who wrote about autobiographies. In memory is this remembering in autobiographical writing as this process of constructing one's identity through narrative. And so like this project that I describe in the book is very much one um, focused on the construction of identity and the preservation of these communities, and sort of the telling of the revealing of oneself through narrative. And so it to in short, I mean, it was a lot of really close reading of hundreds of these testimonies. It took a really long time. Thinking about letters and also like the dialogue that people engaged in when whether or not they were writing to someone specifically, or even in their memoirs, if they were they writing for their community that they had been a part of at one point in time and no longer lived, like people had passed on, or they lived in another city. Um, Yelena Markova, who wrote an entire chapter about in the book, describes how lonely she felt in Moscow. Like she hated living in Moscow because she found such a vibrant community in Vorkuta. And so thinking about the importance of that identity, like she described a Vorkuta diaspora in that pops up throughout her writing, is really important. So it's a lot of close reading, and thinking about idea like theories about cultural memory and collected memory, as I said earlier, and autobiographical writing, I think are really key for unpacking these really complex documents, because they're more than just describing life in the Gulag.
Oh, thank you. And again, very kind offer to the scholar in exile who wrote in. Very kind offer from Dr. Kirk to respond to any questions you may have about, again, kind of the technicalities of pursuing this work in exile. Next question. We just got a couple minutes left, but we'll try to get through a few more questions. Has there been any moral outrage on any U.S. college campuses to the Gulag history of the USSR and the current activities of Russia? If no, why not?
I haven't heard of any moral outrage. There's certainly not been any on the campus of the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And I haven't heard of any elsewhere. I think that, I've talked about this project a couple times now, and it usually garners significant interest. Um, I think that usually I frame it as part of this ongoing conversation about authoritarianism in post-Soviet space and in Russia in particular, and as an important part of the project of the democracy building, and
Mhm.
thinking about why it's important to talk and research and write about difficult pasts. So I can't speak to any instances of moral outrage. I mean, it is horrifying watching what's happened to the Memorial, and I worry
Mhm.
about friends and colleagues who are stuck in Russia all the time. But it's yeah, I don't. It's very deeply troubling.
And I'm just thinking, we have so many wonderful questions here. We're unfortunately not going to be able to get to all of them. We'll try and do maybe two more questions because we've got 2 minutes left. Interesting question here. Did you encounter any people who seemed embarrassed that their ancestors had been prisoners in the Gulag? I encountered that in Siberia and the Russian Far East when I worked there in the mid 1990s.
Embarrassed. That's a really interesting
Hmm.
emotion. Shocked maybe. I think shock was one of the experiences, emotions that I came across. Embarrassed, I don't know if embarrassed would be the word that they would have used. But there was a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of examples of people who, in their shock, in their disbelief that, why did my parents lie to me
Mhm.
about this? But it was also then realizing, oh, like to protect me. And so I think that this was a really, I mean, this was a lots of people came forward, but this was still an incredibly painful, thinking about not just a society, but like in individual families, really painful, um, cathartic experience, of coming forward.
Thank you. And maybe we're at time, but I'll take one last question. So maybe a quick answer to this, but it ties back to that image you had of the Latvian monument. So it says, in
Mhm.
thinking about the Latvian monument, how does the commemoration of survivors, children, exiles, etc., differ in Latvia versus in Russia? Are Latvians aware of this monument, Kumi?
They
Komi?
were, yeah, I mean, Latvians were aware of this monument. They came all the way back, as did Lithuanians and Estonians came back to Komi,
Mhm.
to erect monuments. The, le- the other part of this story that I didn't tell with that monument is that the KGB stopped other prisoners from other different nationalities, other different ethnic minorities from erecting their own monuments in the 50s. Um, like there was this in the confusion after the secret speech in February 1956, there was this like, well, can we talk about this now? And can we commemorate it? And the answer was no. Um, but Latvians did know about it. I mean, they traveled all the way from Latvia to Inta, which was not an easy journey, and there's no direct flight. And so um, Latvia has its own the Baltics have their own very distinct politics, post-Soviet politics of memory, and thinking about the ways in which they were colonized and repressed by Soviets starting in 1940. And that's been the subject of many excellent works. Um, but it was really interesting to read newspaper reports of Lithuanians and Latvians and ethnic Germans and Ukrainians and other people, other representatives of Soviet nationalities, and non-Soviet too, come forward and travel back to Syktyvkar, and even Poles. There was this huge contingent of Polish people who were sent to Komi, at during the Second World War. And Mikhail Rogachev led the charge in identifying their graves. I mean, people continued to um, write to Fond Pokayania in Memorial and Komi, in order to find their loved ones that they had just perished in the region.
Mm.
And so for many, many years, that was one of the ways in which this very like politically unsavory organization, and politically unsavory in the sense that like they were saying things about history that weren't welcome, but they were existed as like, well, we're helping people find their loved ones, and we're like this, it was okay and acceptable to mourn the dead and to commemorate them and to locate them. So yeah, there's this really interesting conversation about that in the book, but in other works as well.
Oh, thank you, Tyler. And I apologize to everyone. We are at time. We're actually a few minutes over time. I know we still had a number of great questions, but I want to thank our guest, Dr. Tyler Kirk, very much for this fantastic presentation in your book, which I encourage people to buy and let your friends know about, or your universities, your libraries know about. Thank you to the State Department again for supporting the Title VIII program. And again, thank you to our audience and all the excellent questions. And we look forward to seeing everyone again next time.
Thank you so much. Take care.